So the 16th century is basically the birth of modern England. We see so much of the early signs of the England that we know now, including the Industrial Revolution. And one of the aspects that most reflects these changes is telling time. I have long been interested in how people kept time during this period and what time meant to people. So I'm going to get a little philosophical in this episode. And, thank you for bearing with me and for your patience with me on that. But, it's one of these things that you read in passing. For example, I remember reading in a book one time that daylight hours were shorter in the winter than in the summer. And I read things like this and I wonder how that would have worked for your average Tudors. So in 1485, time was still quite fluid and the hours changed depending on the season. And by the end of the period, there were pocket watches, which were first introduced in England in 1511. And there would be wall clocks ringing out the hours 24 hours a day in people's homes. Of course, something else that changed during the Tudor period was when the days and the new year actually began. Up until the 16th century, Europe was operating under the Julian calendar that the Romans began. But as time passed, that wasn't actually in alignment with the sun anymore. And that really mattered because of how you were going to calculate Easter. Because Easter, of course, was the first full moon after the vernal equinox. It was this whole thing revolving around the sun and the moons and everything like that. And so Easter kept coming potentially earlier and earlier because of the way the calendar was scheduled. So the Pope, Leo X, actually asked all the European rulers to send their best astronomers and theologians to Rome so that they could calculate a new calendar year. But for a lot of people, this just didn't seem to be much of a priority. Even Henry, who was still a favorite of the Pope at this time, didn't bother to send anyone. And as it went, the changes actually didn't take place until well after Leo's time in 1582, at which point it changed both the solar and the lunar calendars. And to make up for the changes that the new calendar would create, 10 days were removed. And in 1582, the 4th of October was followed immediately by the 15th. It was like when we spring ahead with daylight savings, only with 10 days in between rather than an hour. And to add to the confusion, not every country went with the changes right away. So France did, but England didn't, which meant that it was tough to figure out when a letter was written if it came from France, for example.
We think of time as this fixed unit of measurement. A minute is a minute is a minute is a minute. And that is largely because we have clocks to measure the time. There's this idea that, that measuring something actually makes it more real. If you put a measurement on something, that can wind up creating it. And it gets quite philosophical. If you have named something, does that wind up bringing it into existence?
What's a foot? A foot is 12 inches. What's 12 inches, right? It's just this unit that we all kind of agree on. And yet that is what creates what a foot is and what a yard is and a mile and a kilometer. So the gist for our purposes is that time was changeable for our Tudor friends. We now have clocks on our wrists, in our pockets with our cell phones, in the upper right-hand corners of our computer screens, and we think in terms of precise minutes. When you say you're going to start a meeting at 9 a.m., starting at 10 past 9 makes you late, right? But in an age that started with the most accurate clocks still being off by 15 minutes, in some cases, your 9:15 could be my 8:45 if we were both off by 15 minutes in opposite directions, right? So people often even didn't know what year they were born in. And you see these instances where when people needed to know their birth year exactly, maybe for a legal purpose, for inheritance or something like that, midwives and women who were present at the birth would actually be called to testify as to what year it was. Most people didn't even know what year they were born in, or they would measure the year in terms of the reigning monarch. They were born in the 3rd year of the reign of Henry VII or something like that. So it was all very, very fluid, very changeable, not very fixed. The day was split into hours primarily in order to keep track of prayers. So this was from the church. The morning prayer was prime, followed by terce, sext, non, vespers, and compline. And what time of day that was, according to our civil clocks, could change during the seasons because daylight and nighttime at this time were both divided into 12 hours. So let me repeat that again. At this time, you would divide daylight and nighttime into an equal 12 hours. So the 12 hours at night during the summer in England in June, that's about maybe 7 hours a night. They would say that that was 12 hours. That would be the same amount of hours measured as daylight in England. Both of them would be 12 hours. So you can see that the nighttime hours in England in summer would be shorter than the daytime hours. So in 2002, Scientific American did a full issue on the history of timekeeping. One of the main takeaways from the articles in that issue is that our conception of time changes as we change the way that we keep track of it. Now most rooms have clocks. We set alarms to wake up. We exercise on machines that keep track of how many minutes we've been walking or running. My Fitbit tells me how many hours I slept. There have been many ways to keep track of time over the years. As early as 1500 BC, people used water clocks. They were in popular use by the time of the Greeks around 325 BC. They would use a bowl with markings on the inside and a hole in the bottom to mark the passage of time. Kind of like a basic hourglass or, an egg timer, the kind of thing my mom used to turn over, and it had the sands of time. Wasn't that a soap opera too? Through the sands of time. Was that As the World Turns, maybe? I just remember that picture of the hourglass. That's what it's called, the hourglass, right? So that was useful for marking how much time had gone by, but it couldn't tell you what time it was. And for that, you had sundials, which would measure the time of day based on the shadow that the sun cast on the dial. The problem, of course, with that was that the sun casts different light as the angle changes throughout the year. So the shadow cast in January would be very different than that in July. Before clocks became common in England, people used to say that an hour was the time it took to walk 3 miles in the summer or 2 miles in the winter. Medieval manuscripts explained how to turn your hand into a basic sundial, or even suggestions as how to use local landmarks and the way the sun would shine on them, and the length of their shadows. People would use that to tell time. In addition, in the Canterbury Tales, one of the pilgrims figures out the hour by using the shadow of a 6-foot-tall man. That was another way that was taught to people. And of course, all of these methods also depend on a clear sky in order to be able to tell the time, and it needs to be daylight. So that was something. The clear sky is obviously in short supply in England, especially in the winter. And it's pretty much, you can't use any of these methods at night. Historian Jacques Le Goff suggests that the mechanical clocks were actually developed in part as a way for merchants to clock the time of their workers in the city. Cities were developing at this time, of course. Now, when you're a farmer, you don't really need to know what time it is. You wake up and you work in the daylight, and then you go to sleep at night. You take breaks along the way to eat and to rest. But if you are employed for someone in a workshop in a city, for example, your boss needs to know how long you've been working. This is when we start to really see the development of the mechanical clock, which relies on weights to move a toothed wheel. The mechanical clock at Salisbury Cathedral dates from 1386. It's often cited as the oldest mechanical clock in the world. But even the mechanical clocks still relied on sundials to sync them up. This then also leads to the distinction between time-keeping devices and time-finding ones. Mechanical clocks are excellent at time-keeping, but pretty much useless at time-finding, marking the passage of time, but not actually able to figure out the time by the position of the sun. Other large clock towers were built in England in the late 14th century, such as the one at Wells Cathedral. And this is when we also start to see the distinction between church time, which is, of course, the hours in the church when prayers were said, and clock time when people would mark their working day. But as with any new technology, the clock itself received mixed reviews. Some raved about how useful it was to be able to tell the time even at night, while others, like the English writer of a manuscript called Dives et Pauper, suggest that while planets do not rule men, neither should the clock. We are already starting to see people fearing that men and women are becoming slaves to time. By the 16th century, we have standard periods of time for a school day, and the measurement of hours begins to be consistent during the summer and winter.